Hey guys, welcome to chapter 31 of Adam Brinkley's American History. This is Allie Claire, and I'm saving you guys from failing. I'm just going to start off and tell you guys that I am not Adam Norris. I wrote a lot of stuff down in these PowerPoints because I do not know what's going to be on the quiz because I am not a history teacher, so I'm sorry if this is really long. Okay, so to start off, we're going to talk about Gerald Ford and his presidency. So Gerald Ford inherited the presidency after Nixon resigned from office, and he had two goals. First one was to rebuild confidence in the government. At first, he was pretty successful. Second goal was to restore economic prosperity, and he failed. He suffered a few setbacks in popularity. He granted Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon for any crimes he may have committed during his presidency, and he did it because he wanted to put the whole event past the nation, but the public suspected that there was some secret deal going on and more corruption, which led to more distrust in the government. Most Americans considered him a decent man, and his image of honesty and amiability did much to reduce the bitterness and acrimony of the Watergate years. That comes straight from the book, and basically it means that he was a good man, and his image reduced the public disapproval of the government and hatred and distrust. But he failed to solve problems of the American economy, and he rejected ideas of wage and price controls and called instead for largely ineffective voluntary efforts like Hoover did by the Great Depression, and we all know how that worked out. His ideas, he supported high interest rates, he opposed increased federal spending, and he resisted pressures for tax reductions. There was also a recession in 1974 and 1975 that was largely due to the Arab oil embargo, and what happened was OPEC cartel began to raise the price of oil by 400%, and inflation reached 11% by 1976. Ford also retained Henry Kissinger as his Secretary of State and continued the general policies of the Nixon years. He also enforced and signed SALT II, which stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Treaties, either or, and is an arms control accord intended to reduce arms buildup. And it was signed by Ford and Leonid Brezhnev, sorry, I can't pronounce it, who was a Soviet premier in Siberia. And Henry Kissinger helped produce a new accord in the Middle East by which Israel agreed to return large portions of the occupied Sinai to Egypt, and two nations pledged not to resolve future differences by force, which this was kind of monumental, and Henry Kissinger did a pretty good job. Also, the election of 1976, Ford barely defeated Reagan in the Republican primary, and in the actual presidential election, Ford, as a Republican, ran against Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, and Carter was formerly the governor of Georgia. Carter emerged with a 50% of the popular vote, and Ford had 47.9% of the popular vote, and Carter had 297 electoral votes, and Ford had 240. So it was pretty close, as you can see on the map, but Carter became the new president as a Democrat. Moving on to Jimmy Carter's presidency, and this slide we're going to focus on his domestic policy. And he surrounded himself in the White House with a group of close-knit associates from Georgia. He was exceptionally intelligent, but his critics charged that he provided no overall vision or direction to his government. So he was smart, but he didn't really do anything, is what the critics said. He had an ambitious legislative agenda. I don't know what agendance is, sorry about that. That included major reforms in tax and welfare systems, and Congress passed virtually none of it because they were a Republican majority and they did not get along with the Democratic president. He devoted much of his time to problems of energy and the economy, and he moved to reduce unemployment by raising public spending and cutting federal taxes. And unemployment declined, but inflation roared as a result. Moving on to Jimmy Carter's foreign policy. And during Carter's last 2 years, oil prices rose at, I don't even know what that says. Oil prices rose over 10% an annual rate. Carter responded with a combination of tight money and calls for voluntary restraint. Here's another example of voluntary stuff, just like Ford, just like Hoover, and throughout history, volunteers doesn't get stuff done. Anyway, by 1980, interest rates had risen to the highest levels in American history, at times exceeding 20%. In the summer of 1979, instability in the Middle East produced a second major fuel shortage, and OPEC announced another major price increase. Carter, as a response, retreated to Camp David, which is a presidential retreat, and delivered what is known as the Malaise Speech, which was a series of proposals resolving the energy crisis, and it's notable for Carter's bleak assessment of the national condition. He complained of a crisis of confidence and basically accused the U.S. citizens of not being confident in their government. And it helped fuel charges that the president was trying to blame his own problems on the American people, and that really, really made them mad. Carter pledged to build a new basis for American foreign policy, and he completed negotiations begun several years earlier on a pair of treaties to turn over the control of the Panama Canal to the government of Panama, which made people mad. Senate ratified the treaties by 68 to 32, so it was pretty close. It was right over the two-thirds majority needed. So it was pretty, I don't know what the word is. Figured it out. The word's controversial. Okay, here's some more of Carter's foreign policy. His greatest achievement was his success in arranging a peace treaty with Egypt and Israel. And here's what happened. So, Anwar Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister and Menachem Begin, I'm sorry, I'm not a history teacher. I don't really know how to pronounce the names. Anyway, they began talking in 1977, and talks stalled, and Carter invited them to a summit conference at Camp David and persuaded them to remain there and mediate disputes for them. And so they stayed there for a while, and there were tense discussions, and Carter was there to mediate disputes to create peace. So Carter announced an agreement on a framework for Israeli-Egyptian peace, and Begin and Sadat signed a formal peace treaty known as the Camp David Accords between their two nations. And also during this time, Carter tried to improve relations with China and the Soviet Union to complete a new arms agreement. And Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping attempted to open his nation to the outside world. And on December 15, 1978, Washington and Beijing announced the resumption of formal diplomatic relations, which this is pretty historical, monumental, that's the word, monumental, because China again was open up to the world after leadership of Mao Zedong. And SALT II was finished in 1978, which set limits on the number of long-range missiles, bombers, and nuclear warheads for both the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was met with fierce conservative opposition in the U.S. Okay, there were some foreign policy problems when Carter was the president, because problems happen. Okay. So, since the 1950s, the U.S. had provided political support and massive military assistance to the government of the Shah of Iran. Many Iranians and Islamic clergy formed a powerful revolutionary movement, and the Shah fled the country. And the U.S. tried to establish cordial relations with the militant regimes that followed, but the revolutionary chaos was making normal relations impossible. The power there resided with a zealous leader named I'm not even going to try to say that, but that's the name right there if you read it. So the American embassy in Tehran was seized, and so were the diplomats and military personnel inside. They were kind of held hostage, and the people holding them hostage demanded the return of the Shah to Iran in exchange for their freedom. And 53 Americans remained hostages in the embassy for over a year. And weeks after the hostage scandal, Soviet Union troops invaded Afghanistan, and Carter called this the gravest threat to world peace since World War II. Carter responded with a series of economic sanctions on the Russians, canceled American participation in the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow, and announced a withdrawal of SALT II from Senate consideration. And the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan began a military quagmire and seriously weakened the Soviet regime. Moving on to the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt was in the southeast, particularly Florida, southwest, particularly Texas, and California. And the term was coined by the political analyst Kevin Phillips. And California became the nation's most populous state in 1964. The rise of the Sun Belt helped produce a change in the political climate. Southerners and Westerners produced a strong opposition to the growth of government and a resentment of the proliferating regulations and restrictions that the liberal state was producing. Environmental laws, land use restrictions, and a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit affected the West. White Southerners resented the government's effort to change racial norms in the region. Westerners resisted what they considered efforts by the government to impose new standards and behavior on them. There was this rebellion called the Sagebrush Rebellion that emerged in the West in the late 1970s, and it mobilized conservative opposition to environmental laws and restrictions on development. And it sought to portray the West as a victim of government control. Members complained about the very large amounts of land the federal government owned in many western states and demanded that the land be open for development. Some of the most militantly conservative communities in America were in suburbs. Also during this time, there was new religious revitalization, and in 1966, Time magazine published a controversial cover title with the question, "Is God dead?" kind of questioning the lack of religion in the society. However, the 1970s brought one of the strongest religious revivals since the Second Great Awakening, and it brought the rise of various cults and pseudo-faiths such as the Church of Scientology, which is founded by L. Ron Hubbard, and it teaches that people are immortal spiritual beings who forgot their true nature. There's the Unification Church, which was founded by the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and it believed the purpose of creation is to experience joy and love. Thought Jesus failed God by not marrying and raising children. And there was probably one of the most famous cults that we've learned about, and it was founded by Jim Jones, and they spread a message that combined elements of Christianity with communist and socialist ideas, as well as an emphasis on racial equality. And the members committed a mass suicide in their jungle retreat. The most important part of the religious revitalization was the growth in evangelical Christianity, and evangelicals have a common belief in personal conversion through direct communication with God. People like Billy Graham and Pentecostal leaders Oral Roberts began to attract huge national followings for the energetic revivalism. By the end of the 1970s, more than 70 million Americans now describe themselves as born-again Christians. And Christianity formed the basis for a commitment to racial and economic justice and to world peace. So this, like the Second Great Awakening, it led to more reform, but this time it was in civil rights and Jerry Falwell launched a movement called the Moral Majority, which attacked the rise of secular humanism, which is a term used to describe the rejection of religion in American culture. Pat Robertson began a political movement in the 1990s, an organization known as the Christian Coalition. Catholics, Protestants, and Mormons all came together to protest the Roe v. Wade case, which legalized abortion. And Mormons were instrumental in the 1982 defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment. So, although there was a lot more reform that came from this, there was also a lot of opposition from new born-again Christians to a lot of new revolutionary cases and decisions that went on. So this time also marked a formation of the New Right, and the New Right is defined in our book as a diverse but powerful coalition that enjoyed rapid growth in the 1970s and early 80s. The reason for their rise was Richard Viguier took a list of 12,000 contributors to the Goldwater campaign and used it to begin a formidable conservative communications and fundraising organization. And Goldwater, if you remember, ran for president, and he kind of reinvented the Republican Party and kind of changed their ideals up a little bit. So this guy took money from their supporters and created kind of the new right. And another reason for the rise was credible right-wing leadership and the presidency of Gerald Ford, which destroyed the fragile equilibrium that enabled the right wing and the moderate wing of the Republican Party to coexist. So they couldn't really get along anymore. So, they split and went their own way. Ronald Reagan became embroiled as the president of the Screen Actors Guild in battles with communists in the Union. Reagan became a corporate spokesman for General Electric and won a wide following on the right with powerful speeches in defense of individual freedom and private enterprise. Reagan delivered a memorable TV speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater in his election. In 1966, Reagan won the first 2 terms as governor of California. Ford got hated on because he appointed Nelson Rockefeller, who was a very liberal Republican, as vice president, and proposed an amnesty program for draft resistors, embraced and extended the Nixon-Kissinger policies of détente, presided over the fall of Vietnam, and agreed to cede the Panama Canal to Panama. And once again, 1976, Ford barely defeats Reagan in the primaries. So this kind of marks a decline in satisfaction with Ford and kind of a rise of Reagan's power as a Republican and like new Republican ideology and stuff like that. So in around 1980, there was a tax revolt, and the origins of the tax revolt were Howard Jarvis, a conservative activist in California, launched the first successful major citizens tax revolt with Proposition 13. And Proposition 13 was a referendum question on the state ballot rolling back property tax rates. And Proposition 13 members of the right separated the issue of taxes from the issue of what taxes supported, and it helped them achieve some of the most controversial elements of the conservative agenda without openly antagonizing the millions of voters who supported specific programs. So it was kind of another way to reduce taxes, kind of a way to get around it. And also around this time, there was the election of 1980, and it was Carter versus Reagan. And Carter barely defeated Edward Kennedy in the primary, who was, I think, obviously he's related to Kennedy, but I honestly don't know how he's related to him. You can Google search it. Anyway, Reagan linked his campaign to the spreading of tax revolt by promising substantial tax cuts and also called for the restoration of American strength and pride. And Reagan won 51% of the popular vote and 489 electoral votes, compared to Carter's 41% popular vote and 49 electoral votes. And John Anderson ran as an independent, and he won 7% of the popular vote. Republicans won control of the Senate for the first time since 1952. And on the day of Reagan's inauguration, the American hostages were released after a 444-day ordeal. So it kind of started off as surprising with a kind of a positive note, because they got released. So, yippee. So moving on to Reagan's administration, his supporters were the Reagan Coalition, which was a relatively small but highly influential group of wealthy Americans associated with the corporate and financial world. And it was united by commitment to capitalism and unfettered economic growth, a belief that the market offers the best solutions to most problems, and a deep hostility to most government interference in markets. Also, they were supported by neoconservatives, which was a firm base among opinion leaders, who were people who were once liberals, before that socialists, and they became alarmed with what they considered the dangerous and destructive radicalism that was destabilizing American life. Their principal concern was to reaffirm Western democratic and anti-communist values and containment. New rights had a fundamental distrust in the Eastern establishment, and Reagan was not much involved in the day-to-day affairs of running the government, and he surrounded himself with tough, energetic administrators who insulated him from many of the pressures of office. So he really used his cabinet to his advantage and kind of help him with everyday jobs, duties, that stuff. So he had this thing called supply-side economics, which is also referred to as Reaganomics, and it operated from the assumption that the woes of the American economy were in large part a result of excessive taxation, the solution was to reduce taxes with particularly generous benefits to corporations and wealthy individuals in order to encourage new investments. So this is kind of similar to trickle-down economics. There's also this thing called deregulation, which this is what Reagan did. He shut down a lot of government agencies or reduced them to kind of reduce the national deficit. The economy sunk into a severe recession, but it recovered rapidly and then continued to grow. And both inflation and unemployment remained low during this policy of Reaganomics. So during the mid-1980s, there was a sense of a growing fiscal crisis, and it had become one of the central issues in American politics. Reagan's administration accumulated more debt in his 8 years in office than the American government had accumulated in the entire previous history. The causes were the entitlement programs, such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which became more expensive as the population got older and older. Also, the 1981 tax cuts made it harder for the government to pay off their debt, and there was also an increase in military spending. Reagan's response was further cuts in discretionary domestic spending, which are reductions in funding for food stamps, cut in federal subsidies for low-income housing, limitations on Medicare and Medicaid payments, reduction in student loans, school lunches, and other educational programs, and an end to federal aid to states and cities. So obviously this made lots of Democrats mad because they were cutting a lot of the programs that earlier administrations had created to help kind of the poor and those kind of people. And U.S. governments called for a constitutional amendment mandating a balanced budget, and it came within a few votes of passing in 1994 and 1996. So during Reagan's presidency, there were some international issues, and Reagan wanted to become active and assertive in opposing communism and in supporting friendly governments. So relations with the Soviet Union were chilly in the first years of Reagan's presidency, and he called the Soviet Union an evil empire, declaring it sponsored world terrorism and that any armaments negotiations must be linked to negotiations on Soviet behavior in other areas. Reagan continued to honor SALT II's provisions, and he implemented this thing called Strategic Defense Initiative, which is also known as Star Wars, and it's the use of masters and satellites to provide an effective shield against incoming missiles and thus make nuclear war obsolete. The escalation of Cold War tensions helped produce a movement in Europe and the United States calling for an end to nuclear weapons buildup, and the principal goal was a nuclear freeze. Reagan had a Reagan Doctrine, which supported the opponents of communism anywhere in the world. This also led to new American activism in the Third World. In Grenada, U.S. troops were sent to oust an anti-American Marxist regime. In Nicaragua, pro-American dictatorship had fallen to revolutionary Sandistas, and the U.S. supported the so-called Contras, a guerrilla movement drawn from several anti-government groups trying to topple the Sandista regime. In 1982, the Israeli army launched an attack of Lebanon to drive guerrillas of the Palestine Liberation Organization from the country. American peacekeeping force entered to supervise the evacuation of the PLO, and they remained in the city to protect the fragile Lebanese government. And Americans became the targets in 1983 of terrorist bombings of a U.S. military barracks that killed 241 Marines. And as a response, Reagan withdrew these military forces. So, moving on to the election of 1984, it was Reagan versus Walter Mondale. And Mondale was kind of a revolutionary candidate because he appointed a woman, Geraldine Ferraro, as his potential vice president. And Reagan's campaign emphasized phrases such as, "It's morning in America and America's back." And this was a decisive victory for Reagan, and the Democrats gained a seat in the Senate. Okay, in Reagan's second term, the Cold War began to kind of cool off. And reasons for the decline of the Soviet Union was the government in Moscow had failed to address a long-term economic decline in the Soviet republics and the Eastern Bloc nations, and restiveness with the heavy-handed policies of communist police states was growing. And Mikhail Gorbachev, who succeeded the leadership of 1985, kind of paved the way for better relations with the United States. Every communist state in Europe overthrew its government or forced it to transform itself into a non-communist government, so it kind of made the Soviet Union stand alone. Gorbachev's policies was glasnost, which was the dismantling of many of the repressive mechanisms that had been conspicuous features of Soviet life for over half a century. And also he had perestroika, which was an effort to restructure the rigid and unproductive Soviet economy by introducing elements of capitalism as private ownership and the profit motive. He also reduced Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Not all challenges to communism were successful. Students in China launched a mass movement calling for greater democratization, and leaders seized control and sent military troops to crush the uprising. And the result was a bloody assault on June 3rd, 1989 in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Beijing. And the assault was crushed the democracy movement and restored the hardliners to power. And the government in South Africa began to retreat from apartheid, which is a system designed to protect white supremacy. And it legalized the chief black party in the nation, the African National Congress. And it released the leader of the ANC, Nelson Mandela, from jail. And he became the first black president of South Africa in 1994. And there was an unsuccessful coup by hardline Soviet Union leaders. And many Soviet republics declared independence, and the Soviet Union was unable to stop them, and Gorbachev finally resigned and the Soviet Union ceased to exist. So moving on to Reagan and Gorbachev's relationship, there was a summit meeting in 1986 where Gorbachev proposed reducing nuclear arsenals on both sides by 50% or more, and continued disputes over Reagan's SDI program, Star Wars, prevented agreements, but in 1998 the two countries signed a treaty eliminating American and Soviet intermediate-range nuclear forces from Europe. Also, there were political scandals during Reagan's presidency, and there were revelations of illegality, corruption, and ethical lapses of the EPA, CIA, Department of Defense, Department of Labor, Department of Justice, and Department of Housing and Urban Development. But a more serious scandal emerged within savings and loan industry, and the government was forced to step in to prevent a complete collapse. In November 1986, the White House conceded that they had sold weapons to the revolutionary government of Iran, and part of a successful effort to secure the release of American hostages. And some of the money from the arms deal had been funneled into a fund to aid the Contras in Nicaragua. And this really upset the American people, and it did a lot of damage to Reagan's presidency, although he wasn't directly involved in what happened. So moving on to the election of 1988, first of all, I'll start off with the Democrats gained control of Senate in 1986, and for primaries and nominating for president, to run for president, for a lot of Democrats refused to run for president. And Michael Dukakis, a three-term governor of Massachusetts, got the nomination and ran against George H.W. Bush, who was the former VP. H.W. Bush failed to spark enthusiasm, but launched a campaign viciously attacking Dukakis, and it was probably one of the most vicious and negative campaigns in history. And Bush won 54% of the popular vote and 426 electoral votes, compared to Dukakis' 46% popular and 112 electoral votes. So the negative campaigning did work. So that shows success in this type of campaigning. So moving on to H.W. Bush's presidency, his presidency was notable for dramatic developments in international affairs and for the absence of important initiatives or ideas on most domestic issues. Bush cooperated with Gorbachev and, I don't know what that is, passed a series of significant agreements with the Soviet Union to further reduce arms. Domestically, Bush promised to reduce the deficit and proposed no new taxes, and those two conflicted with one another, so he didn't make a lot of domestic progress. He did cooperate with Congress to salvage the savings and loans industry, and in 1990, Bush agreed to a significant tax increase as part of a plan to reduce the deficit. In 1990, there was a recession that caused an unusual number of bankruptcies and increased fear and frustration among middle and working class Americans. So that was kind of a downside of his presidency. So a major event that occurred during his presidency was the First Gulf War. And after the USSR collapsed, the United States didn't know what to do as the only real superpower in the nation anymore, in the world. And they decided to use its power to defend its regional and economic interests. They invaded Panama and overthrew the leader Manuel Noriega and replaced him with an elected pro-American regime. In August of 1990, armed forces of Iraq invaded Kuwait, and Saddam Hussein announced that he was annexing Kuwait. And the Bush administration agreed to lead other nations in a campaign to force Iraq out of Kuwait through the pressure of economic sanctions or war if necessary. Bush persuaded virtually every important government to join in the United Nations sanctioned trade embargo of Iraq, and at the same time, the United States and its allies deployed a large number of military along the border of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. On January 16th, the U.S. and Allied air forces began a massive bombardment of Iraqi forces in Kuwait, and this continued for 6 weeks. And in February, forces were released under the command of General Norman Schwarzkopf and defeated Iraqi forces with few American casualties. There were a lot of Iraqi casualties. And Iraq announced acceptance of Allied terms for a ceasefire, and the war came to an end. And this did preserve an independent nation and kept an important source of oil from falling into the hands of Iraq, but it did lead to increased Muslim dislike of America and American intervention. Finally, the election of 1992 was Bill Clinton versus Bush versus Ross Perot. And Bill Clinton ran as a Democrat. He was a 5-term governor in Arkansas, and he was an early front runner. And H.W. Bush was running for re-election as a Republican, and Ross Perot was a Texas billionaire who ran as an independent candidate by tapping popular anti-sentiment of the federal bureaucracy and promising of tough, uncompromising leadership to deal with the fiscal crisis. He led in public opinion polls, but he faced hostile scrutiny from media and withdrew. He re-entered but never regained the same following that he had earlier. Clinton won with 43% of the popular vote and 370 electoral votes, and you guys can see the other scores of the other candidates. But Bush lost to Clinton, and Ross Perot did not get any electoral votes. Thank you guys so much for watching. Ace the quiz. Do well. Sorry for being so long, but that's all the information.